And welcome everyone to Press TV's news review program. We'll get in depth in one of the day's top stories. Let's go. Iranian security forces have confiscated a consignment of U.S.-made weapons in the central city of Isfahan. Announcement was made by the city's judiciary. They said firearms had been smuggled into Iran from western border for potential use during recent riots in the country. Officials added the seized arms indicate enemies were plotting to trigger an armed conflict and kill civilians in a bid to tarnish the image of the Islamic establishment. Iran's witnessed a wave of public protests last month over fuel price hikes, but the demonstrations turned violent after certain people infiltrated rallies and began attacking public and private property. Iranian officials said infiltrators were backed by foreign countries. Joining us now for this news review is David Yahubian, professor of history out of Cal State University, San Bernardino, California, and Tony Gosling, investigative journalist, joining us from London. I'd like to welcome you both to the program, gentlemen. I guess so we'll start closer and then move away. We'll start there in London with you, Tony. Your thoughts on why we're seeing guns pop up in caches of this size here on Iranian soil?
Well, look, there's a tremendous amount of weapons circulating the black market, US particularly, and this has been a deliberate policy over the years to destabilise countries. I mean, this is one of those things you just have to understand the post-war world. The US has been almost scattering arms, particularly over Africa. Africa's been a real brunt of it, enabling almost anybody to pick weapons up, find weapons cheaply, and start uprisings. And this is actually a covert policy of the US and has been really ever since the end of the Second World War. But this specific business looks as if it might well be related to the Al-Qaeda project, because the Americans in the 1980s started something called Operation Cyclone. And that was to arm the Mujahideen over in Afghanistan. And then they've used these specific individuals that they've trained using their special forces training, and then they've taken those people to all other parts around the world, actually, even including the conflict in Yugoslavia. The Bosnian Muslims were part of this. A US armed and US egged them on to do it. But the other thing is that the Americans have been funding these civil society groups as well. So this is a very pernicious thing. If you've got a little NGO in your country, you may not know that it's actually being funded by the National Endowment for Democracy, which sounds great, but what they're doing is they're using these organisations to destabilise countries. And so we've seen no reporting of that. I was watching the news in the West here tonight, and no reporting of it whatsoever on the BBC, which is psychological warfare. And now, of course, the way that the West, particularly the United States, is using sanctions against Iran is economic warfare. They're using almost everything they possibly can, apart from actual open warfare. The Russians are lucky because they have such a great, vast natural resources that they're not hit so hard by economic warfare as for example, Iran, which it finds it very difficult to cope. But anyway, the Iranians, I think, to sort this problem out, it's a really tough nut to crack. The economics warfare to figure out how to deal with it, but. There are quite a lot of economists in the West even who've suggested all sorts of tactics to deal with this, including something called People's QE, which is a way to insulate your population from the effects of economic warfare. So I think that's something that the Iranian finance ministry should seriously look at, because we need new ideas to this unprecedented degree of economic warfare going on. They call it sanctions on the news over here, but of course it's a form of warfare, and it needs to be very imaginatively dealt with and decisively dealt with. And hopefully then, there are all sorts of things. This People's QE is a good idea, but by dealing with it in that way, through making sure that some of the basic essentials of life are provided by the state, you get a great reaction from the people, and then they don't want to go out on the streets and protest, even if the sanctions increase. So I think the finance ministry in Iran needs to really consider some of these more extreme options, because there's still, even in Islamic finance, there's still vested interests that want to keep the status quo.
I'm going to swing over to you now, David. Thanks for joining us. Your initial thoughts on this?
I fully agree with my colleague that this is straight out of the CIA playbook going back some 7 decades, that playbook being applied in Southeast Asia, in Latin America, to Eastern Europe, and as well to the Middle East. And he mentioned, I think, accurately in context, Operation Cyclone, but we have a much more recent and relevant example out of Syria, and that would be Operation Timber Sycamore, which was unleashed on the Syrian population and government between 2012 and 2017. And this is no secret. This has been widely reported on. The news about it came out in 2015. The CIA was supporting Islamist so-called rebels, which they referred to as moderate opposition, with small and heavy arms, from machine guns to ATGMs, anti-tank guided munitions, RPGs, mortars, in an attempt to overthrow the legitimate government of Syria. And meanwhile, while that was going on, as Seymour Hersh detailed in his 2014 article, The Red Line and the Rat Line, what he referred to as a rat line, a covert arms pipeline coming from former Gaddafi's Libya into Syria in an attempt to bring the destructive capability of the former Libyan military into Syria so that it could be used in conjunction with the Timber Sycamore arms to overthrow the legitimate Syrian government. In 2017, Representative and now presidential candidate Tulsi Gabbard and Senator Rand Paul even came up with the Stop Arming Terrorists Act in an attempt to oppose the actions of the U.S. government and the CIA in Syria. So again, this is no secret, and even led to a proposed legislation to end this activity. So I don't think anyone should be surprised at all with the cache of arms that was found in Isfahan, and I think the Iranian government needs to remain vigilant against this type of component of the hybrid war that the United States is engaging in against Iran.
And David, it almost stinks. I mean, in the face of international law, it seems like it really something should really be done about, perhaps a superpower. We don't even know if it goes back to the U.S. The judiciary in Isfahan says it feels that there's foreign forces that are arming these people or pumping these guns into the country. It could be regional countries as well, adversaries that Iran has in the region itself. So we really don't know, but it just seems like not enough is done these days to stop people from putting guns in a nefarious group's hands.
I fully agree with you, Daniel, and not only would I concur that not enough is being done in this context, but as well, we're talking about issues such...
Tony, hold on a second. Let David talk on it. I'm going to get it to you. Go ahead, David.
Excuse me. We're even talking about issues related to weapons of mass destruction, chemical and biological weapons, such as in Seymour Hersh's article that I referenced, the attempt concurrently in 2012 to also blame the Syrian government for chemical weapons attacks that would have been staged by the rebels. And to underscore your point in your question, we now have several whistleblowers from the OPCW who are providing information related to the OPCW report on the so-called Duma gas attack, which shows that it was completely bogus, the final report that was put out. And the reason that I'm mentioning this is even though we have the WikiLeaks documents and now the emails that are coming out, the mainstream media doesn't touch it. And so far, we haven't seen anything done at the United Nations related to the fact that it seems that the OPCW report on Duma was doctored. So even in the face of evidence that's being provided that anyone could go out and Google and see right now, the mainstream media, unfortunately, in the West is not covering this story at all, and there's been no traction at the United Nations. So in terms of calling the United States on the carpet for its hybrid warfare, its covert support for, the MEK terrorist cult and its economic terrorism, et cetera, against Iran, unfortunately, this does not seem to be possible currently.
Tony, go ahead, buddy. You were saying.
Yeah, I just think we have to be absolutely clear. In fact, these are US weapons. Doesn't actually mean they came directly from the US. This is what a form of deniability. they will be going through an arms dealer somewhere. Somebody will be making a lot of money out of selling these weapons. And so the Americans will hold their hands up and say, oh, nothing to do with us. They just happen to be US weapons. But look, really, like I said, the toughest nut to crack is going to be the Iranians will need nerves of steel, because you have to solidify the country in order to withstand this economic warfare. And if you don't, what will happen is you will have riots across the country, because people will be deprived. They won't have the basic things that they need to live. And that is what the American tactic is, to try and get the people out onto the streets, then to infiltrate those with their own people. But if you've got the people on side, they won't come out onto the streets, will they? And the way you do that, I think, we've got in the West here some of the best economists like Michael Hudson, Steve Keen, Richard Murphy. These people have been banging their heads against a brick wall here. And in fact, some of the ideas, if Jeremy Corbyn had been elected in our recent general election here, could have been actually trialled in the UK for the first time. The old money system is out. It worked for centuries. After 2008, I'm afraid it's dead. There was just an enormous great bailout, and the banks are insolvent. So we need a new money system, and the People's QE is a very good way to do it, I think. It means effectively to make sure that everybody has a basic minimum for their basic needs provided by the state. So very basic. We're not talking about a luxury lifestyle. You can even make public housing free, make basic foodstuffs like bread free, and some cities in the world, public transport is free. These basics need to happen, I think, and then you'll find that the economic warfare will have virtually no effect. So in a way, I suppose I'm challenging the Iranians here to finish the 1979 revolution and to ensure that all their citizens have all the basic needs that they need. And then I think you'll find that no one will be coming out onto the streets because they'll all know that they're not going to be deprived of the basics. And these ideas, a lot of them started here in Britain, but they've been taken in other places. And unfortunately, at our general election, we didn't get them. But the ideas are there. All it needs is someone to be brave enough to take them on and to grapple with these ideas. Iran could, if it does do this sort of thing, it could be an example to the world.
Gentlemen, thank you both for joining us. David Yacoubian from San Bernardino, California, and Tony Gosling there joining us from London. And viewers, that's a wrap for this segment of your Press TV's News Review. Thank you for tuning in, and goodbye for now.